Why are you doing this?
Why? Because of you. Your arrogance, your hubris, your indifference. You strut through life, adored by everyone, never stopping to see who you've crushed beneath your shining popularity.
You'll never get away with this.
Ha! You laughed at me. You treated me as though I was invisible. But evil will not be ignored. Evil is patient, and evil strikes when the time is right.
Who are you?
You never stop to think that the call could be coming from inside the house. That the killer could possibly be...
your own friend.
Who?
It's me, Craig. Sophomore chemistry? I brought Doritos to study group. I lent you a pencil.
Nope, don't remember ya.
What? How could you not? I literally sat behind you for an entire year.
Did you play sports?
No, I did Model UN.
Wait, you were a model?
What? No, not a model. Model United Nations. We debated foreign policy in the library.
That sounds so lame.
What? I wore a hoodie that said Craig on it in block letters. You guys waved to everyone in the hallway except me.
I don't know, man. You just got one of those faces.
What are those faces? What? I practiced this reveal in the mirror. I worked on my dramatic timing. And you're standing there acting like I'm just some random...
Hey, Craig, while you were rambling, I dialed the police. They heard everything. Guess the call really was coming from inside the house, am I right?
Got him. Freeze! Drop the knife!
Well. What? You don't remember? Dad, you abandoned my mother and me, left us to struggle just to chase wealth and power. Everything I became is because of you.
No, I left because my kid was so lame.
I'm your son.
Do you know this guy?
Never seen him in my life.
How is this possible?
Did you play sports?
No, Model UN.
You never said your kid was a model.
Motherfucker!
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I am Gage Hurley.
And you have arrived on the desolate Bavarian farm, the freaky farm of Creep Street Podcast. That's right. I'm not going to waste any time buttering you up, get you all warm and fuzzy with the foreplay, because we already know what we're talking about. Today's episode is The Shadow Over Hinterkaifeck, Part 2. And of course, as last week, my sources are the book The Farm That Heard No Screams by Louis D. Underwood and hinterkaifeck.net. But before we push any deeper into this bloody mystery we're knee-deep in, let's stop and frame the picture one last time to sort of refresh our minds from last week.
Let's take a look at the case files. Let's take a peek.
Let's do it. Let me open this filing cabinet. Yeah, yep. Hinterkaifeck. There's Herman, Hank. Oh, Hinterkaifeck. Here we are. Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ooh, wow. Covered in blood. Ooh, nasty.
Geez. Graphic.
Woo.
Those photos, my God. Be glad you're not seeing these photos, folks.
Oh,
my goodness.
Nasty.
Grisly.
Well, folks, as we know, Hinterkaifeck was more than just a haunted, lonely Bavarian farm. It was its own tiny little self-contained planet, in a way. And there it was 6 souls that orbited this farm. Andreas and Cazalia Gruber, hard and weathered, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 children, little Cazalia and Joseph, the 2-year-old. And, of course, the new maid who arrived the night before, Maria Baumgartner, fresh to the house and just in time for a nightmare. Well, by late March of 1922, the air on that farm, as we know, had gone a bit strange. Footprints were appearing in the snow, marching in from the woods and never marching back. Footsteps echoed in the attic where no one should be. Keys vanished. The dog barked itself crazy at the darkness, night after night. Something or someone seemed to be circling the farm, and then that quiet was shattered when one by one the family was drawn into the barn and killed with a mattock. Methodical, unhurried, and absolutely silent. The killer didn't stop there, as we know. They then went into the house and murdered the young Joseph and the maid, Maria Baumgartner. Then they covered the bodies with straw and barn doors, and they actually lived there, ate their food, milked their cows, slept under the same roof as the 6 corpses. For days, the farm sat silent while neighbors and a passing postman invited harmless little reasons for their absence. Maybe it was illness or errands, bad weather. But as we know, the first man to break that silence is also probably our number one suspect, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Oh, the Schlitz.
The Schlitz.
The Schlitz. He was a widower. He had a complicated history with the family, and of course was said to be the lover of Victoria and very possibly the father of the 2-year-old Joseph. He led a search party straight to the bodies. He somehow had a key that everyone thought was missing. He seemed to know just where to look, just what to touch and what to avoid. And later he let slip unsettling details that only the killer should have known. But gossip, as we know, doesn't hold up in the court of law. The courts could not touch him. And while Lorenz became the town's favorite villain, he was not the only suspect. Next up on the suspect was actually none other than Karl Gabriel. Yes, that's Victoria's supposedly dead husband. He officially died on record in 1914 in the Great War, but his body was never found, which obviously was sadly very common in World War I and is actually fairly common in all wars, unfortunately. And in this case of Hinterkaifeck, that meant his grave was never truly closed. Some believed that Karl had come back to find his wife's son Joseph born after his death. Came back to find people saying that Joseph wasn't his boy at all, but Andreas Gruber's, Victoria's own father. According to this theory, the idea was that Karl returned home, snapped, went into a rage, and did the dang thing. In fact, not many people, and here's where, that seems like it could be far out there, but when you really think about it, we know that Victoria, after his death, moved back home, meaning Karl didn't live there. So people might not know what he have looked, especially if he came back with a beard, if he came back with Scott. They might not know what he even looked like, so he could ask, so how about that Victoria Gruber? He could pretend he's someone else, someone just passing by. And then he learns all these dirty secrets that supposedly, Andreas and Victoria, that Joseph was perhaps the product of incest. So when you think about it from that lens, it's actually a little more feasible than you might think.
Yeah, and he was gone for 8 years, supposedly.
Right.
So if he did return, that is a pretty significant amount of time. Somebody could definitely change a lot in 8 years, especially the older they get.
Right. But the one thing that kind of holds that idea back is that apparently there were many men on the front lines of the war who said they saw him fall. Now, also doesn't necessarily mean he died. They could have seen him maybe take a bullet and fall, but, in the fog of war, who knows what becomes of that person, you know what I mean? Especially if you're in the thick of it, in the trenches. And as we know, World War I in particular was just absolutely brutal, as all war is, but World War I in those trenches was just absolutely a nightmare. But then The next pair of suspects were the Gump brothers. Oh, boy. That's right, Adolf and Anton Gump. They were bad company, tied up with a unit called the Freikorps Oberlin, a paramilitary outfit that left more than one corpse behind in the chaos of post-war Germany. The suspicion burned hotter in 1951 when their sister, on her deathbed, said it outright, that they did it. Adolf and Anton Gump killed the Grubers. Now that might chill you, but words alone, as we know, can't hold up in court. Anton got locked up for a while, but that case fizzled. And Adolf was already long dead by then, dying in 1944, which I don't know when that other Adolf died, but that seems right around the same time. It does. Right. Then there is the Thaler brothers, another pair of brothers, Joseph and Andreas, also, funny enough, the same first names as two of the victims. They were the next to get the finger pointed at them. But their former maid said Joseph Thaler had once asked her about the Grubers' money, about where they slept, about the farm's layout. Now that was enough to raise concern, of course, but again, no weapon, no witnesses, no proof, just a half-hearted accusation that really went nowhere. And then, on the stranger side of things, we have a gentleman named, well, maybe not a gentleman, but a man named Paul Mueller, an immigrant who left Germany for the United States, and according to crime writer Bill James, Mueller left a trail of axe murders across America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Whole families were killed in their sleep, always with a mattock, always the same pattern. Some say that Mueller might have come back home to Germany and Hinterkaifeck was his pièce de résistance. It was his final bow, as you might say. The stories line up too neatly to ignore, but of course, that isn't proof. Mueller vanished from American records, and tying him to Bavaria is nothing but paper-thin speculation. Beyond that, it was the usual chaos of suspicion. But there is one more that I wanted to add in there. Now, this one is the one that's far out there, straight out of like a pulpy horror novel. But we know, for example, there was noises in the attic. And when they would hear him, Andreas would get up and run up there to see who was up there, but no one would be up there. But there was found food up there in the attic. Now, this is obviously most likely not the case, but those with maybe a flair for the horrific, if Andreas truly was a serial incest guy, that maybe there was someone up there, but someone he expected to be up there, not the intruder you would assume. Maybe, hidden away from the public eye, they had hidden away a person born of incest, maybe severely disfigured. They could see out the windows, and they learned how to milk cows or feed the cattle by watching out the windows, and maybe one night they got loose and killed the family and escaped into the Bavarian night. Now, that's a little more on the outrageous side, but one I wanted to throw in there, I think the original, when I first heard this tale on Blurry Photos back in like 2014, I think they had mentioned that. And that always was like kind of a more so like a creepy fun explanation. Obviously not a lot of like weight thrown behind it. But really, I would think if it wasn't, Lorenz, I find myself actually considering the Karl Gabriel route, especially if he came back maybe already not in a good frame of mind, coming back from the war. And then you see that and you hear these awful rumors, and who knows what a man's mind in that time would have been like, especially fresh from a god-awful war. Who knows what could have happened.
It's also possible, depending on what happened to him in the war, what if he had suffered a long-term amnesia of sorts? Didn't actually remember where he was from and his family and all that. until he eventually did, and that's when he came back. And of course, maybe it was all the more devastating.
That's actually a very good idea, right? I mean, yeah, maybe he kind of roamed around Europe for a while, aimless, unsure where home was. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The Karl Gabriel idea is the one that kind of like draws my attention the most, just because at first it seems like, oh, no way, the guy came back, after everyone thought he was dead. But you consider World War I, it's not like today where everyone's got a cell phone and credit cards that you can trace them by. And when you think about the time that has passed, grow a beard and put on a hat, no one other than Victoria would probably know who he was.
Exactly.
So he could just pretend to be someone passing through town, ask some questions, and so who knows?
I mean, like I said earlier, 8 years is a long time. I've heard of cases where people had missing kids and they would mistake somebody else as their missing kid years later. So,
right.
And especially at this time, you probably had what? They may have had one photograph of the guy?
Right, exactly. And it's probably a grainy old black and white photograph. I mean, absolutely. But in the 1950s, investigators decided to dust off the old case files, thinking maybe with new science, they could perhaps find out who did this evil deed. But by then, of course, much of the evidence had been burned, lost, stolen, or just simply eaten away by time. Many of the witnesses were already in the ground themselves. Thus, the reinvestigation went nowhere. In 2007, the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy gave it another try. Students and teachers went through every scrap of paper, every half-legible note. They built their own theory, and some say they even named a suspect, but they never shared it. Reportedly, out of respect. They said for the descendants of the man they thought did it, which part of me thinks that maybe, I don't know, you didn't get it then? I don't know. Because, you would think they would still just name, who knows? Maybe it's because they had a good idea, but no, smoking gun evidence, so therefore they didn't say, because why do that unless you're 100% certain? So who knows? But in the digital age, Hinterkaifeck found a new stage in message boards, Reddit threads, and sites like hinterkaifeck.net, all buzzing with their own theories. Some were serious, some rather wacky. But the point is, people from all over the world still pore over this case, tracing the footsteps in the snow and arguing about who fed the cattle, who tended the farm in the days after the murder. And it's not just the internet. Academics use this case in criminology classes. Podcasters like us and documentarians continue to drag it back into the spotlight every few years. Books retell it, each one layering another shade of unease. I think there's even a play, because I think they were even doing it in Chicago once. I saw a billboard for it. There's even a play based on the Hinterkaifeck murders. But by April 5th, 1922, the Grubers were already in the ground. But their story wasn't finished. In the barnyard at Hinterkaifeck, court physician Dr. Johann Baptist Mueller set up his shop. And by shop, it certainly was far cruder than any hospital or morgue, but the man made do. Just some rough tables and makeshift gear, and the smell of straw and death hanging in the air. And it was there in that very barn in the dirt where they died that the family was cut open again. But this time, the people doing the cutting were looking for answers. And here is what they were absolutely able to, for sure, determine. Andreas Gruber, 63, the patriarch of the family, his skull was smashed so badly that the cheekbones poked through like knives from inside the skin. Multiple blows, each one hard and deliberate. You could tell the killer hadn't wanted to leave a face behind. In fact, it was easy to determine that the killer kept on a whacking long after Andreas had died, which would seem to insinuate that when you compare it to the other bodies, and we'll note strange things on the other bodies, there was a little more heat coming for Andreas. Whoever did this might have had a little more anger and ill will built up towards him. the fact that they kept whacking long after his face was putty, seems to indicate not just a madness, obviously, but a little extra spice on Andreas, a little extra heat, a little extra anger. Now, Kazalia Gruber, she was the wife of Andreas, 72. The old woman had not gone easily. There were signs of strangulation, as if the killer wanted her silenced before they even brought the mattock down. She took 7 blows from the mattock over all, her skull shattered in rage, pure and simple. Now, the strangling there is pretty interesting. Now, I've seen different sources say that it was also that Victoria showed signs of strangulation, which would also indicate strangulation almost implies like this was someone who you at least one time cared about. That sounds so silly to talk about someone you strangled, but maybe the hope of the killer was not to necessarily mutilate them, but just make them go quiet, essentially, just strangle them out. Maybe they thought, who I really want to kill is Andre, and they thought, oh God, now I have to kill Kazalia, but I want to do it as quote unquote as nice as possible. And then maybe when she just put up too much of a fight, they grabbed the old mattock. Then there was Victoria Gabriel, 35, the widow, gossiped about by the townsfolk. Her skull was beaten like the others. No exact number of strikes, just it was enough to make sure that there was no mistaking in death. Of course, Joseph, the 2-year-old, still in his cradle, obviously him and his big sister were the most innocent people in all of this. Maria Baumgartner, 44, was the maid who had barely been there a day and absolutely a case of wrong place, wrong time. She was found in her bed, her skull crushed like the rest. Now, a lot of people think that she probably thought everyone was asleep, like maybe she was coming back from a thing, and because they think that she came in without knowing any better, thinking maybe everyone was in bed, quietly went to her room, laid down, went to sleep, and also never woke up. The killer then came and got her. And think about that. You're coming home, you're going through, you brush your teeth, you're doing all this, all the while the killer's just waiting for you to go to sleep. Like, that's pretty wild.
And especially assuming that the rest of the family is dead by that point, too, just not even knowing. That is creepy to think about coming home and the rest of the family's dead and you don't even know and you just go to bed.
Right. Yeah. Well, and think about this. I mean, the killer, might have missed a good opportunity to, if he spared her, to essentially make a scapegoat out of her. Who knows? People could have said, if she was out at someone's place, they could have, maybe witnesses could have essentially given her an out if they were like, well, she was with us. But yeah, that's another thing. It's like, hey, maybe the killer could have, if he would have left her alive, she might have been the one that everyone blamed for it.
Yeah, you never know.
I mean, it's her first day there, and murder wasn't a thing until she showed up.
Another thing, too, is that obviously the killer stayed in the house for several days after the murders.
Right.
I wonder if that had something to do with the motivation for killing the maid as well, as he didn't want to leave yet.
Right. And that's why some people have wondered if this was just a case of just a mad vagrant passing through, killed a family when they were, maybe they were hiding in the attic or whatnot. But like we said, then again, you would think if there was a sudden discovery of someone, that there would be there was no signs of struggle in terms of these people walked one by one to the barn. So for it to have been just a vagrant, just that was someone passing through, who knows? You would think it would have to maybe be someone they somewhat trusted to, especially if you're going to lure them to the barn.
Who knows? Maybe this person is just that good of a killer or good of an assassin or who knows what.
And of course, as we know, little Kazalia, this was probably the most disturbing part of the whole story for me when I first heard it, but they were able to tell that she lived for hours after she was hit. In fact, she had clumps of her own hair in her little fists indicating that she was yanking at her hair and whatnot. That's just awful to think about. But assessing these findings, Dr. Mueller was sure of one thing, and that was obviously what we all know, that the weapon was a mattock. And as we know, this is It's sort of one end is like a pickaxe, the other end is like an axe, sort of. And what was interesting was the weapon itself was never found at the time of the discovery of the bodies. But later, when the farmhouse was demolished, they dug up the blood-caked mattock hidden in the attic. The killer had left his tool behind. But forensic science in 1922 was barely a shadow of what it is today. Also, it was buried, meaning they never found it in the first place. No DNA, no fingerprint databases at the time, so the crime scene was already ruined before officials really even got there, because neighbors had just walked through it and touched things, even cooked meals like dipshits. Like, who cooks a fucking meal when there's bodies in the house? How do you even have an appetite? But anyway, so why did the killer stay for so long? Was it a feeling of control over what they had done? Maybe it was a compulsion, or like we said, maybe it was someone looking for shelter, they got discovered, and they killed everyone. Or maybe it was someone who realized what they did, felt obviously it was instantly overcome, like maybe with grief and regret, and maybe wanted to pretend like life was just life for a few days, tending the sheep, maybe because what's interesting is the bodies were covered. They were not buried. And let's be honest, it didn't seem that the killer's intent was to hide them as well. Merely they were just stacked and covered with hay, especially their faces. Almost neat, perhaps even with reverence. Forensic psychologists say that perhaps the killer may have felt regret, as I said, and chose to hide their faces out of shame. It may also imply a sense of irreverence, but maybe not for the slain, but for some sort of higher power. A very grim, more modern, obviously not like this, but a similar thing was wrestler Chris Benoit, the murder-suicide he committed when he killed his wife and child, and then he took his own life. Now, there was many things that played into that. There was steroids, there was CT, there's all these things. But when the bodies were discovered, Chris Benoit, I think he had taken a Bible and I think placed it under their heads, seeming to indicate maybe he snapped out of whatever rage he was in and almost felt like it was a way of like, oh God, like a reverence thing, or even if it's not reverence, it's still like a sense of duty, like, well, here's at least something.
Some sort of spiritual gesture.
Exactly, right. So obviously these are two very different stories, but there is something to note there, especially if they stayed for a while. Perhaps they were familiar with the place, and, it would make sense why they would cover the faces of the slain. And while the murders themselves were very violent, they weren't sloppy. There were no signs that this was botched or that the killer had to do anything outside of what they originally intended. Now, granted, we don't know their plan, but other than the strangling of the older Kazalia, there really was no sign of a struggle. And even that struggle seemed to have been intentional, like they wanted to strangle them, not like she walked in on him killing Andreas and then he had to quickly so it would seem that this all went according to plan. There was no frantic running as the case ensued or victims who fought back. There wasn't anyone who tried to run and then got dragged back into the barn. Whoever this was almost seemed to know their world and wore it like a skin, walking around in it for 3 or 4 days, even after they were all dead. Victoria Gabriel is obviously kind of the central figure in all of this. If Andreas, her father, was truly the tyrant that people said he was, Victoria might have been the hinge that the whole door swung on. And when she died that night, she took with her, she was probably most likely, if anyone knew the truth behind this, it was probably Victoria, I would think. Because, yes, Victoria did return home after her husband's death, but by 1922, she wasn't just some helpless widow. She had standards. She had money of her own. And by the time of her death, Victoria wasn't just another farm wife. She'd actually pulled cash out of the bank, enough to set tongues wagging, and enough to give her a little leverage in most situations. Rumor said she had planned to hand off some of it to the church. Others thought she meant to run away with it, start a new life. she was the farm's real steward after all, a rare thing for a woman in Bavaria at that time. Land, bonds, livestock, she controlled her own money. And while that made her strong, it would have also made her a potential target. The scandal that never went away, of course, was the possible entanglement between Victoria and her father. What's interesting is the records actually show in 1915, incest charges were brought upon both of them. Victoria herself served a month, Andreas a whole year. By 1919, though, the courts came sniffing again, but backed off for lack of proof, which, side note, what was their proof before? What was the original proof then?
There really wasn't any.
So, do we know that Andreas might have forced himself on her? Well, if we know he did it once, then he probably would have done it again. So, that's kind of interesting to note. Like, what evidence was so foolproof that they were able to actually charge them 4 years earlier? That, to me, was a big, weird...
You'd think it must be something. They must have had something.
Right? Absolutely. Some say that Victoria and Lorenz were said to be planning a marriage once, and that Andreas stepped in to put the kibosh on it. And when the Gruber family lay dead, of course, Lorenz was the one who found them. He walked into the farmhouse with a missing key he shouldn't have had. He moved the bodies. Some say, according to the source, that he wept. Others say he didn't. In fact, there was contention over how Lorenz reacted to the discovery. Like I said, some said he wept. Others said he was strangely calm and closed off. Now, obviously, who's to say how anyone would act upon such a situation? Like, you can't really base someone's, we all react to things different. So especially when you walk into something like that. So all we really have to go on is hearsay. Ooh, just had to take a quick pause there, Creep Street, just to give your poor palpitating heart a rest. If you're enjoying this episode, go ahead and follow us on Facebook, Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod, TikTok at Creep Street Podcast. That's right. And if once a week is not enough for you, just head on over to patreon.com for all sorts of goodies. We got 3 different tiers there, something for every tier. So get your fixins. We even got a free tier where you can listen to the weekly sketches before they go live on the episode. Now, without further ado, back to today's story. The money drained and their plans abandoned, a few weeks before the murders, Victoria emptied her account. Villagers claimed she was going to donate it. In fact, that was what she must have told some people her intention. Maybe that was just a cover story till she could make the necessary arrangements to run away and start a new life. Who knows? Maybe Karl did come back and was actually like, hey, let's get out of here. I'm back, honey. And maybe Lorenz found out about it. That's another potential option. I mean, everything is mundane until someone ends up dead. Taking money out of the bank is an everyday thing, but suddenly if you take all your money out of the bank and then the next day you're dead, well, suddenly that withdrawal seems a little suspicious. So who knows? It could have just been poor timing. But it also could have been maybe Lorenz wanted a piece of that cheddar. He didn't want her to give it to the church.
Yeah. Who knows? What if this was a potential kidnapping case where actually maybe the family was being held hostage? Maybe one of the last things the killer did was make her tell her she had to go into town and withdraw all her money or he was going to kill somebody. Maybe he had been there for some time already. And then maybe he did, after he got the money, finish the job, stayed there for a little while, and then ran off with all the money.
Right, absolutely. That's a great point. Well, some neighbors swore that they actually saw Victoria in the woods the night before the killings, looking frightened. Others described her as shy, quiet, obedient. But one thing that seems clear is that Victoria's life was full of sparks, just waiting for the right tinder to light. There was inheritance, paternity fights, incest rumors, talk of escape. I mean, we're talking an episode of Sally Jesse Raphael here. This is a Jerry Springer episode playing out in Bavaria. I mean, it really is. This is the kind of shit you would have seen in the 90s on Jerry Springer.
We did hook up last Wednesday.
But then, of course, there's Maria Baumgartner. On the last evening of March 1922, Maria Baumgartner had stepped onto the farm with a satchel in her hand and a little hope in her heart. Maria was 44 years old, obviously not young by the village's measure, and maybe by 1922 living standard. She wouldn't have, today we call her middle age, but, back then she was, seen as a bit older. Keep in mind, Kazalia, the elder Kazalia, was 72, but she was 44 and had long been looking for permanent, honest work. Maria had grown up poor, without much education, and with modest ambition, but she wasn't dreaming of grandeur. This isn't the thing. She wasn't wanting to make a lot of money. She just was dreaming of having steady bread on the table and a little money to ease her mother's final years. That was enough. That's all she wanted. Her sister, Johanna, traveled with her to the farm, both of them bouncing in the wagon before trudging up the last stretch of the muddy tracks to the farmhouse. And the house waited for them like a black tooth in a jaw of the woods. Johanna would later remember Maria's nervous laugh, the little flutters of excitement about her new steady position. No one records what Maria was thinking when Victoria greeted them on the porch. She was shown to her room, which was a small square box with a narrow bed and a window that looked out into the barnyard. That night, she ate with Victoria and the elder Kazalia. She went to church with them. She didn't sing any hymns. She didn't belong to this family, this land, or this town. Maybe she sensed something was off. Maybe that's why her notebook later carried the line, "The Grubers seem unloved." So that means within one day of getting there, she has become well aware of how the town feels about the Gruber family, which means if it only took a day to figure it out, then that means probably people don't care for him much. And Maria apparently even mentioned almost in passing that she felt watched. Now, maybe she just meant by her new employers, like they were just kind of keeping an eye on her. But who knows what she meant? Because it's obviously, as we know, it's one of those mundane things that after a murder happens seems a little more suspicious. On April 4th, when the neighbors and Lorenz forced their way in, they found her where she had been put in her little room, her head caved in and body quiet. The autopsy said her death was swift. Some wonder if she stumbled into the wrong part of the house at the wrong time, saw a shadow move in the attic, or caught sight of someone in the barn. Maybe she was awake when she shouldn't have been. Maybe she saw too much. What is certain is her presence did not change the killer's plan. It merely expanded the plan. Her clothes were still folded, her few things untouched. Maria was not killed for greed. She was killed because she just happened to be there. Because she had the bad luck to want to work in a house where death had already unpacked its bags. And keep in mind, we mentioned that in the last episode, but it's a good thing to remember. No one's valuables were taken. That also might rule out a vagrant who might take the cash or whatever's on hand.
And the guys, who earlier, I might have been the Gump brothers, whoever asked about the layout of the house, asking real weird questions.
Right.
That sounds more like somebody who wants to rob the place.
Absolutely right. And Johanna, her sister, tried to keep her sister's name clear for years, but Maria kind of faded into the margins, reduced to a line in police reports. Arrived March 30th, killed April 1st, aged 44. She obviously deserved more than that. She was proof that these killings were not about money or vengeance alone. And so Maria lingers in this story as the servant who walked willingly into the nightmare, thinking it was honest work. She is the echo most people miss about this case, the maid who went to bed early and never saw morning. That evening of the murders, a landlord reported hearing strange noises. The postman found the kitchen door half open. So this is the evening of the murders. And so already you have the postman seeing the door half open. Wouldn't maybe indicate someone was chased into the house? Maybe Maria tried to run into the house, tried to shut the door, but the killer, maybe she saw what was going on, tried to run inside. Killer got their foot in the door. Who knows? But we also know there was no sign of a struggle. By nightfall, between 7:30 and 9 p.m., was when the killer made his move. Court testimony later suggested that the family was lured, as we know, one by one to the barn. Hours later, Maria was struck in her small room, and then the baby Joseph, barely 2 years old. April 1st. So let's go over these days between the murders and the discovery. April 1st was a Saturday. Teacher Sophia Fuchs noticed that little Kazalia was absent from class. Coffee salesman Hans and Edward Shrovsky knocked and said they saw strange tracks. Saw that the machine house gate was hanging open. That same day was when the carpenter, Michael Plockel, came out there at dusk and reported as he was working hearing hammering sounds, seeing smoke in the hearth, and flickering lights in the tree. So that's interesting because remember, this was the repairman. He was there for 4 hours. Couldn't find anybody, knocked and knocked. So if he heard hammering, he probably went to find out who was hammering and say, hey, I'm here to do repairs, which seems to indicate he couldn't find the source of the hammering. Also, lights in the trees. Now, what does that mean? Lights in the trees, like lantern lights, someone walking with a lantern through the woods, which could be a mystery person coming from the forest. Maybe they had a little lantern with them, candles, something. But it says the tree. So who knows if they just meant the tree line or if they meant the trees, which would almost indicate some sort of like a aerial thing, which is weird. April 2nd, Sunday, the church pews stood empty where Victoria and Kazalia should have been. A friend stopped at the farm to collect them for service, but no one answered. Another villager came for lard and found nothing but silence. And the postman noticed the children's stroller was missing in the newspapers piling up at the window. April 3rd was a Monday, the postman again. Kitchen door closed, drapes untouched, newspapers left where he placed them. The place just looked abandoned, but he could tell the animals were cared for, which meant someone was there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. And then, of course, on the day they were discovered, we know the mechanic was there to fix some of the farm equipment. He got there at 9 a.m, and the yard was still, the windows bolted, the place dead on its feet. He even whistled while he worked. He expected any minute for the farmer to come out and say, what are you doing there? But no one came. He spent 4.5 hours on these repairs, noted how the cows had been milked. The dog was barking like crazy. The barn door was hanging open. By mid-afternoon, still no sign of the Grubers, and that's when Schlittenbauer and his boys came a-calling. And they found the same thing. And then Schlittenbauer, of course, was the one who found the body. He had with him 2 men, one named Paul and the other Siegel. Paul and Siegel. April 5th, Inspector Reingruber and his team arrived from Munich. There, they photographed the scene, noting the still warm hearth. So even warm the following day. Crumbs from a recent meal, and the cattle likewise fed and tended to. Dr. Johann Mueller performed the autopsies right there on the farm. The victims' heads were removed and sent to Munich for further study, and they were never returned. Inspector Reingruber later called the crime scene, quote, irreparably altered, which is polite code for ruined. No coordination, no controlled entry, no chance in hell of reading the story written in the dust in the Gruber's blood. And April 7th, under cold skies, the bodies were buried solemnly without their heads. Forensics, of course, was in the dark ages in 1922. Fingerprints were rarely taken outside of big cities. DNA was still a fantasy, and of crime scene photography, merely 5 grainy photos actually survive. No cast of footprints, no blood splatter analysis, no proper measurements, just a handful of medical notes and 6 skulls sent to Munich. Skulls that vanished forever in the chaos of World War II. Too many chiefs and not enough power. Hinterkaifeck lay in a no-man's land of Bavaria jurisdiction. Local authorities had no resources, and the Munich police arrived too late with little authority over the locals who mistrusted them. These were good old, honest country folk, and these were big city boys from Munich. Of course, they were a little untrustworthy. Communications were slow and intermittent. Files shifted from one desk to another. Investigators replaced, priorities scrambled. Weimar Germany was buckling under hyperinflation, political street wars, and the rumblings that would birth the Nazi era. A rural murder scene didn't stand a chance with all of that going on. Hundreds questioned, but nobody caught. More than 100 suspects were actually interviewed. Everyone from vagrants to traveling salesmen to neighbors, even family. But all leads fizzled. Theories rotted away as soon as they bloomed. Was this a robbery? Well, no, because everything was still there. No cash or jewels or prized possessions were taken. Was it revenge? Possibly, but they couldn't find a perp to stick it on. Everyone was examined, but nothing was nailed down. Hyperinflation turned the money to wallpaper, essentially. The beer hall putsch put Bavaria on the map for all the wrong reasons. Political assassinations filled the headlines. And Hinterkaifeck, therefore, just shrank away from those bigger national and international stories. A 100,000 mark reward was offered, but, as we said, inflation made the sum pretty much worthless before the ink even ran dry. Journalists moved on to other stories. So did the police. Cold case reinvestigations came in the 50s and then in 2007, but each time they ended in the gutter. And by then, of course, by 2007, all the hard evidence was gone. The skulls were vanished into oblivion. The farm had long been demolished. And any witness that might have been alive was very unreliable because they would have probably been well over 100 by then, or at least close to it, maybe in their 90s. The 2007 team hinted, like we said, that they knew who it was, but I don't really buy it. That just, to me, it seems like they couldn't prove it. Or maybe they got as close as they could. If they had to guess, they kind of knew who it was, but without 100% proof, didn't want to just throw a name out there. So who knows? What adds to the horror here is how lucky the killer got. From the bad timing, to the bad politics, to the bad procedure. A century gone by and the farm is long gone, plowed under, burned, and erased. But Hinterkaifeck refuses to stay buried. What was once a grim headline in 1922 has turned into something bigger, nastier, and stranger. A story that just won't quit. A seed dropped into the Bavarian soil that sprouted into folklore, sprouted into controversy, and sprouted into ghostly tales. Then came the lights. By the 1930s, the farmhouse still stood but was broken-backed, and people swore they saw flickers in the window, heard noises in the woods behind the house. The papers printed from those stories like gospel. You can't underestimate how hungry people were to turn tragedy into a spooky sideshow. Well, if you could name a cursed farm, this was pretty much it. And one detail that I forgot to add that was interesting, that was just one more can of gasoline on all this, is that in the days before the killings, the family had noticed on their doorstep a newspaper that was from nowhere nearby. Some sources even said that it wasn't even written in German, that it wasn't even like a German newspaper. Now, how the hell would a paper like that end up on that doorstep out in the middle of nowhere in the hills of Bavaria? Maybe that adds a little more in the direction of Karl or someone who's just rambling through. Very interesting. Now, by the late 20th century, the myth had swallowed the facts whole. A student film in the 1980s turned Hinterkaifeck into a gothic nightmare. Radio plays painted it darker still. And then came the big guns. Andrea Maria Schicknel's Tanad in 2006 was a worldwide bestseller and a film adaptation in 2009. Suddenly, Hinterkaifeck wasn't just a Bavarian ghost story, it became an international property. And as we know, like we said, podcasts, documentaries, even Amazon Prime's Lore had their own take on it. Some were clinical, some speculative, and some flat out blamed the supernatural for what happened. And the internet only made the story that much louder. Reddit threads mixed real evidence with fictional stories. Stories that included witches, cults, demons, all manner of things. Some people swear they even heard phantom screams near Hinterkaifeck to this day. Can they all be lying? Why does this story stick with us? It's because Hinterkaifeck pushes all the right buttons. Violence in isolation. A killer with a motive that seems beyond just petty violence. Someone staying and feeding the cows and the livestock and taking care of the farm. People can live with horror if there's an explanation. It's the unexplained that keeps you up at night, that captivates us. And while the farm is gone, the story is very much alive. In fact, a shrine stands on the very spot now where the farm once stood. Just a stone cross, plain and somber. And it says what it needs to say. 6 names, 6 lives cut short, but the silence around them is still as alive as ever. You can feel the gap between fact and folklore when you're out there for yourself. Out of that chaos came reformers like Ernst Gennett, the so-called king of Berlin detectives, who insisted on cordons, evidence control, discipline. You could almost say the Grubers were buried twice, once in their graves and once in the training manuals of every detective who came after. But the murders did more than just rattle the cops. They rattled the villages. They rattled all of Germany. Folks in rural Bavaria began drawing sharper lines between private life and public duty. Too much silence, too much watching from the windows while the Grubers vanished from church, school, choir. If anything, the gossip never stopped. Neither did the second guessing, but it taught people that if they see something, as cliche as it is, if you see something, say something. How about a wellness check? How long do you wait before you knock on a neighbor's door? How much privacy does a family earn before it becomes secrecy? Well, that tension never really went away. Now, today, people talk about possibly being able to use AI to rescan the old files, to tease out fingerprints of the yellowed photographs. Maybe that's possible and maybe not. There will probably never be a last word on the murders of Hinterkaifeck. And in that blank space, the unanswered and unresolved is where you'll find the story is at its cruelest. But maybe that's why we all keep listening, because deep down, we know what the Grubers learned too late. Sometimes the scariest sounds in the world are the ones you don't hear. And that, my friends, wraps up the tale of the Shadow Over Hinterkaifeck. So yeah, I mean, Gage, what do you think here? I mean, this episode is more kind of going back over the actual autopsies, the forensics of it, which, as we know, not much of it remains. So a lot of this episode is throwing out the various theories, the speculations, all that stuff. If someone said, Gage, you got to decide right now who did it, even if you don't have a name, even if it's just a vagrant, or it's Lorenz, or it's Karl, or whomever, where would you put your hat?
Man, it's so tough because there's so many compelling ideas around a few of the suspects in particular. One we didn't really talk about as much was Paul Mueller, who really, the murders fit his MO, which was so interesting. This guy committed multiple murders with an axe.
Right, and a mattock. Which, right, and he left a trail of blood throughout the United States, and who knows, maybe he was able to somehow slip back over to Germany, and because obviously the man was not sane, so I mean, who knows if he would have just crawled into the cargo of a ship and just kind of secretly went back over, or, I mean, that's a story, that's a Creep Street episode right there. We got to figure out, I'm going to see if I can find any sources on this guy, because that would kind of be a cool, like, episode of its own that's kind of an extension of the Hinterkaifeck lore in a weird way. The Paul Mueller thing is so fascinating. And then two, similar but in a less dramatic way, is Karl Gabriel.
Yes. He's the other one that it seems kind of improbable. There's so much that would make sense if it was him.
He would actually have, granted, Paul Mueller probably didn't know the people well that he killed, but insanity doesn't need an excuse, I guess. But Karl would
conceivably have a motive.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And if his mind is somewhat fractured from the war and, you hear these awful rumors about your wife.
And this is his home. So this person stayed for days after. I mean, what does that tell you? They wanted to be there. It could have been just, it's a place for some killer passing through, or it could be that it had some sentimentality behind it.
Right. Because you can imagine, in my mind, I imagine this guy, maybe he's grown out a beard, he comes in, it's Karl, but he's, pretending to be someone else or maybe he asked the locals. And, and of course the locals, as we know, were all too eager to gossip. And maybe they're like, yeah, that Victoria, she's a freak, her and her dad, they're just nasty. That was, he hears that and he's just, it just throws him into a spiral. And
that's the most, that one is probably the most interesting and maybe the most compelling, not necessarily meaning the most believable, but the most compelling because it seems very possible that he was misidentified as dead. I mean, probably like in most wars, they don't always know for sure. And it just seems feasible to me that he didn't die in the war at the very least.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder why, say it was Karl. Obviously, you know why he'd be pissed at Andreas. Victoria, even though she didn't deserve it, just in the crossfire in the heat of the moment. What I don't understand is if it was him, why he would do that to the little Kazalia, and especially leave her laying there.
Yeah, not even do it quickly, but to actually leave her and let her suffer for hours, which, clearly whoever did this didn't hold back on some of the other people, so yeah.
And think about that. Now, assuming that the killer would have known little Kazalia was still alive, unless maybe she was knocked out first and then came to, but that also implies this killer was, already we know they were crazy as hell, but that would almost imply a truly a demonic, that is, already it's demonic to kill the whole family, but if that killer knew that little girl was still, that just, ooh.
And you also think, if it was Karl, you wouldn't also think he'd be luring them out. It would almost seem like a crime of passion, like that the guy would just burst into the house and start going mad. We also talked about this person maybe feeling some regret after the fact, but you wouldn't probably feel regret after the fact when you so calculatedly lured one at a time over the course of hours, each one of the barn, killing one after another.
Right.
That seems sadistic. It seems cold and sadistic.
Absolutely. And then you think if it was Lorenz, I know is the, it makes sense. He's got the key, he's entangled with the family. His on paper does make the most sense. That's the other thing about the incest thing. It's so they had enough evidence to send him to jail 4 years earlier, which makes me wonder if Andreas did at least one time force himself on Victoria and maybe somehow she screamed.
Because maybe there was no evidence other than her word, but her word came right after it happened. Like you said, maybe she screamed, somebody heard, and then they took her word enough, and the circumstances of the situation basically may have been enough to make the arrest Or it may have been enough that they were okay making the arrest. It doesn't actually mean that they made a proper arrest based on evidence either. We can only assume, too, the further back in time you go, the more corruption in law enforcement. Anywhere.
Oh, yeah. Well, also, why did Victoria have to serve any time at all? Like,
maybe they had some sort of laws against that. I don't know. That's a good point.
Maybe that was a law, a specific law that was on the books, that if it's between two people who are related, rather than calling it rape, it was called incest, and therefore was a crime that two people, I don't know.
Yeah.
You would think that would just be called rape no matter who it is. But, who knows how laws were, obviously we don't know everything, the whole story. That's why this mystery continues to enthrall us. But I'll tell you what, Gage, I got a list of names who I know would take care of the cows if you and me were brutally killed in our sleep.
Oh, yeah? Who's that?
The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Vieren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. Yeah, that's right, folks. That's right. If you see the mail stacking up and you haven't seen your friends for a while, maybe knock on the door, give them a text, a phone call, see how they're doing. Because I think we could all use a little of that, especially after a tale like this. But folks, let me tell you, before we sign off here, man, oh man, do we have some fun things ahead. Coming up next, part of our illustrious 6th October here on Creep Street, we are doing in a 2-part series, the OG, the namesake, Vlad Dracul, a.k.a. Vlad Dracula, the Impaler. Yes, folks, that's right. We are going right to that Transylvanian source. We are going to sink our fangs into... And let me tell you something. This guy was nuts. As the name Impaler would imply, he made use of them wooden stakes. Let's put it that way. And boy, oh boy, are we going to get into some grisly tales next week. But folks, we thank you. We love you. We can't thank you enough for all your support. Please head on over to patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast for all sorts of goodies. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night and goodbye.